perhaps there's a way that we can be with this stuff so that it has less of an impact on the way that we are connecting and engaging with the world around us, so that we can free up some mental resources to engage more fully in our lives. And if we really kind of clarify what matters to us deep down and set values-based goals to work towards, then and if we can have some success in doing that in spite of this stuff still being here, it's kind of like learning to put it down, kind of hold it lightly, let it rest in our laps, rather than either have our heads buried in it like this, or be in a struggle with it where we're kind of like, I've got to get rid of this stuff before I can live my life. If we can find a way to be with this stuff more openly and more freely, while bringing our attention to the world around us, the things that we care deeply about, our relationships, our interests, and the things that we value, and take action towards those things, then what we find is, well, firstly, life starts to feel a bit richer and fuller, and I have more of a sense of vitality in my life. But secondly, this stuff starts to change by itself anyway. If part of the stuff in here is maybe self-doubt and self-esteem issues, if I can see that I'm able to, in spite of having this stuff in my life, I'm able to live a life that is meaningful and connected to my values and have fulfilling relationships, then my self-concept is probably also going to start to shift a little bit too. My mind starts to be a little bit kinder to me and say nicer things about me. So that's kind of ACT in a nutshell. It almost sounds like a bit of a trade-off, like we're saying, okay, well, let's sort of sacrifice symptom reduction for goal setting and values-based behavior change. But in fact, there is no trade-off at all, because all the research clearly shows that ACT achieves the same level of symptom reduction as CBT, even though that's not what we're focusing on when we're doing ACT. So for me personally, as a psychologist, when I'm working with clients, I just find it a much more sort of vital and energizing way of working with clients than having this focus sort of on the negative and how can we have less of the negative. The focus is much more on the positive, and the negative stuff kind of takes care of itself as part of that process to the extent that it can. But we're also acknowledging that, like I said before, to live a full life as a human is to experience great suffering.
I think I would love, my layman interpretation is that CBT might be, there's a program going on here and we want to try and change that program. Whereas ACT seems to be ACT, not Canberra, but ACT seems to be, I see the program, it's there, what can I do instead? And then those actions tend to change the programming anyway. That's kind of what I got in that in a nutshell. Would that be the layman's summation?
Yeah, exactly. So I guess kind of a good little sort of example of that would be, let's say someone's struggling with like confidence issues and some social anxiety. A kind of a more sort of CBT type approach, we might look at trying to build this person's confidence by changing some of the narratives and beliefs they have about themselves and their ability to perform socially, etc. to give them the confidence to start engaging in those activities. The ACT approach would look more like getting them to start engaging in those activities connected to their values and their sense of meaning and purpose, while developing some skills to deal with the anxiety when it shows up, and see what effect that has on that person's confidence when they have some success doing that. And, you know, lo and behold, if you start, you start engaging again socially and having success in doing that, you know, surprise, surprise, confidence starts to go up anyway.
I love that. I'm just saying hello to the people on the call. Jeff is very much appreciating your knowledge bombs here, Anthony. If you guys have any questions on ACT or CBT, I'm just watching the feed here. Feel free to drop them and I can read them out. We're going to move on to us as health professionals. So dealing with overwhelm is a common thing that I'm hearing from new grads and from some employers who I mentor, is that I have a team or young team members who are feeling overwhelmed. And probably the second most common thing is burnout and people leaving the profession. Is any of this on that spectrum of mental health? Do you think it's a completely altogether separate issue? And would there be a way practically or applying ACT principles to that situation for us as young health professionals? I know there's a lot in there to unpack. Where would you start?
Yeah, well, look, I guess some of this is like semantics, like, you know, as to whether do we call that sort of a mental health issue, or is that something separate? But certainly burnout and kind of continually day after day feeling overwhelmed at work could lead to some you know, more serious mental health difficulties. In terms of dealing with that, you know, I think so. Burnout, I think, is defined as a kind of a loss of vitality at work, a kind of a lethargy and cynicism towards one's work, a kind of disconnection with values and sense of purpose, a kind of feeling of like not caring about things that used to feel important to you, things feeling very much sort of same and old and dull, or feeling disconnected emotionally from the work that you're doing, even if it is, you know, sort of work that should line up with your values. So I think there's quite a key element in there, which is connection to values. And so I think the way to avoid burnout is to make sure that you have the opportunity, and maybe this isn't something necessarily that employees can necessarily control, but so for any employers listening, this is definitely something to think about. Are you giving your staff the opportunity to work in a way that aligns with their core values? And is that something that is really kind of intentionally focused on in the workplace? Because, you know, I'm a big believer in the inherent sort of resilience of the human body and mind. So this isn't necessarily something that is tied to stress alone. Like, you know, burnout isn't something that happens just because you've been working long hours. It's something that happens because there's an inherent kind of values piece that is missing from the work that you're doing. So I think making that intentional in the workplace is super important. I guess in terms of the other thing you mentioned, like the overwhelm, I think a good analogy would be, experiencing sort of fatigue and overuse injury in a physical exercise kind of context, where the human mind, like the body, needs to have a recovery period from periods of stress. It can adapt incredibly well to incredible hardship and incredibly difficult circumstances, but it needs time to adapt, and it needs that recovery time. And you can't expect people to do long hours day after day doing the same kind of emotionally stressful work without the opportunity to refresh and rejuvenate themselves, without that eventually leading to the equivalent of like an overuse injury.
That's a really good analogy, comparing it to an overuse injury. What tips would you have for a young health professional who might be feeling either of those come up for them? Are there things, just really small things, practically you could do in your day versus the bigger issues like my core values are not aligned with this place or my work as it currently stands?
Yeah, so I guess there are some really great sort of self-care things that people can be thinking about, and the best sort of advice or tips that I've come across for that are come from a neuroscientist and a psychiatrist by the name of Dan Siegel. And he does a lot of research on mindfulness and what he calls interpersonal neurobiology. So sort of like how brains relate to each other. And so he developed something which is kind of supposed to be the kind of the mental equivalent of like the healthy dietary pattern. So place like Harvard have produced this sort of graphic of what a healthy plate should look like, and having the kind of balanced diet. He's talks about a equivalent sort of thing, like a balanced diet for your mind and what that looks like. So he's got 7 different things there. I would encourage anyone listening to go and look that up. If you just Google Dan Siegel Healthy Mind Platter. So I won't go through all the 7 things there, but it's things like play, for example. And this is something that as adults, especially once we kind of get into the, sort of the rat race of career and focus and being serious and paying rent or a mortgage and all these kind of things, play and being in a playful state of mind, is something that we often really neglect. And play doesn't mean, playing soccer on the weekend and following the rules and trying really hard to beat the other team. That's not play. Play is what kids do when they do dress ups and they imagine that they are a monster, and they're creative and they get rid of the rules and they're silly and they have fun. And it's a way of being in the world that is not really encouraged too often for adults. So that might look like dance. That might look like something creative that you do, some creative arts, or improv drama, or if you have kids, you know, that just following their lead and being silly and goofy. But there's lots of these kind of mental states, like ways of being in the world with your mind that we don't spend a lot of time doing. And so he describes these 7 different kind of ways of being in the world that we should aim to do every single day to kind of give our mind the balanced diet that it needs to thrive.
It's super interesting. Where my mind goes is, we were speaking a couple of weeks ago how we're not sure if overwhelm and anxiety is actually more prevalent or it's just discussed more. But what it seems to me like, from an employer's perspective, whichever one of those it is, it's more in the narrative now if you're
Mm-hmm.
part of a team. So it seems to me that we need to shift as teams, as team members and employers, to start to include this in the conversation. I think that's where a lot of employers are going wrong. It's just like, here's the workplace, here's the patients, here's what you do clinically, this is how you rebook. And we're just missing this 90% of things that might actually keep a healthy human. Do you have any thoughts or perspective on that?
Yeah, I think you know, I wonder if perhaps people feel they're not equipped to kind of step outside, you know, the sort of the typical sort of, you know, professional workspace domain,
Mm.
and have those kind of conversations with their staff. But you know, I think that those kinds of relationship building interactions and creating opportunity for that in the workplace, creating a workplace environment where people feel safe to speak about how they're feeling.
Mm.
You know, I mean, I'm sure because of the way that a lot of kind of views on mental health have changed over the years, you know, employers are probably hearing a lot more of this stuff in the workplace because it would have been so stigmatized in the past for an employee to say, oh, you know, by the way, the reason I couldn't come into work last week is because I was having a panic attack in the morning. You know, that was probably a good way to lose a job.
Mm.
So, you know, if you're hearing your employees saying things like this, encourage those kinds of conversations. Don't definitely don't kind of push that away and discourage it. You know, not talking about it doesn't make it go away.
Mm.
It just kind of makes it fester beneath the surface. But it's going to come out, you know, one way or another.
I think it brings up a good point of, I'm speaking to many new. I had 2 messages today on Facebook about 2 young team members who weren't sure if they should stay, and then I spoke to 3 business owners today who are completely overwhelmed. Um, you know, they're not sure if they can keep doing what they're doing. So there's this giant gap, and it doesn't surprise me that the retention rate in as a health professionals is so low and that burnout is so high, because we have seemingly a generation that feels a little disconnected, like we were talking about just before this call, less personal relationships. We can go into that. And then we have a bunch of business owners who are stressed out of their eyeballs. And I guess what they're learning, what I'm trying to teach just from what I know, is we actually need to be better in this whole area, which is a brand new area that you've never thought about, like mental health, creating culture, creating core values for each individual that you have there, opening up a dialogue for these conversations. And they're like, what are you talking? I can't do this. I'm stressed with what I'm doing just now. How do we close that gap? Because that to me seems like this giant chasm that could be creating this problem that we have of a lot of health professionals leaving.
I mean, this is a $1 million question.
Yeah.
Not one I can necessarily answer for you definitively.
Yeah.
When you say closing the gap, you mean like a gap in kind of understanding between business owners and employees, or?
I feel like we've got team members asking for help, screaming for help with overwhelm and burnout and not being mentally healthy more than ever. But then business owners are feeling the same and don't seem to have the capacity or the skills to do what you just mentioned, which is like core values, culture, open communication about this stuff.
Yeah.
What could we do to close that gap as young team members, and what could employers do to try and meet in the middle there?
Yeah. Do you find that that business owners feel like, because I wonder if there's a bit of a sort of hierarchical thing going on there, where the business owners feel like they need to be this sort of like authority figure who kind of gives the instructions and tells people what they need to be doing. And I wonder if a more sort of collaborative or, you know, sort of empowering approach that perhaps, you know, takes a little bit of a leap of faith and puts some more trust in, you know, their staff. Because like I said, in terms of burnout, when people feel disconnected from their values, is when you start to see, you know, this kind of loss of vitality and interest and care about work. And you know, what then tends to happen is when people lose that sense of purpose and meaning, and all people, when humans, when we lose our sense of purpose and meaning, we become far less tolerant of stress and distress in our lives. When we have a very clear purpose that we are deeply committed to, humans can tolerate incredible hardship. So rather than thinking about necessarily, you know, reducing stress, if we can think about increasing vitality and connection to values and purpose and meaning in the work that people are doing, I think that would go a long way to addressing that problem. But that really, I think, requires a collaboration where you know, obviously the business owner needs to kind of set the culture and the values of the business, and they need to, you know, through their recruitment process, you know, make sure that they are hiring people who are aligned with that kind of mission. But also, I think they need to hand over a little bit of control and power and you know, self-efficacy to their staff, and let people decide how they best put those values into practice in the work that they do. Obviously, you know, whilst being ethical and you know, adhering to all the guidelines and processes that they need to. But there's always scope. I think people often misunderstand what values are about in ACT. When we talk about values, we're not talking about necessarily like things that I really want to have more of, or that I that I want to achieve. We're talking about ways of being in the world, qualities of action. So even if I have very, very little choice in my life, even if I'm a prisoner, I've been wrongly convicted and thrown in jail for the next 20 years. And it's like, well, how can you possibly live a life of, how can you be connected to your values? All your choice has been taken away from you. Well, then the question becomes sort of like, well, what kind of prisoner do I want to be? What do I want to stand for in the face of this injustice and this challenge that I've been given? So there's actually values give us this opportunity to exert our independence and our freedom, even in very strict, kind of confinements, which, compared to a prison, hopefully the workplaces of the people listening to this are a lot more free and flexible. So there's always opportunity to do things connected to your core values, even when you don't necessarily get to decide, some of the sort of processes or procedures that are just a necessary part of how you go about doing your work. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, 100%. And I think I'm thinking from a team member's perspective now. If you're feeling this way, let's say your first year out or second year out, and you're feeling that way, what would you encourage that young team member to do? Would it be to explore some of that for themselves, or speak to their employer, or speak to someone external?
I mean, obviously, I've got a sort of, I've got a biased perspective on this, but I would say don't let things kind of get to breaking point, before thinking about like, oh, what do I need to do now? Or maybe I need to see a psychologist now because I'm like waking up in the night having panic attacks and I can't sleep and I'm, grinding my teeth and I've got no appetite during the day and I'm finding myself bursting into tears in the bathroom. Like, don't let it get to that point. There's no need. Um, be proactive. If you're starting to notice that you're struggling and you're not feeling enthusiastic and motivated to work, so starting to notice these signs of burnout, or kind of this accumulation of stress, then go and talk to a psychologist and get some expert guidance around how to deal with that. That's what we're here for. You could go and do a psych degree and a post-grad qualification, and you could do all the work yourself, or you could just consult with someone who's done that in exactly the same way you would recommend your patients to do if they were starting to notice some pain or some kind of niggle that was giving them difficulty. You wouldn't say, oh well, it's not bad enough yet, wait till you're on crutches and then come back. It's always better to nip these things in the bud, right?
100%. And I think we were speaking a couple of weeks about destigmatizing that for health professionals, as health professionals feeling like they're the person meant to help, and that in itself might be deemed as a failure. There's a bit of a burden on that, and not just health professionals. I think you were saying everyone. It's still a little bit stigmatized to say I've gone and seen a psychologist or I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, it is, and I get that, but that's changing.
Yeah,
I think that's changing quickly. And you know that you remove stigma by being open about things. And so you know, you being that person who mentions to a coworker that you know, you've been having a quite a hard time, and so you've you know, you've had a couple of sessions with a psychologist and they suggested this or that, then suddenly, just by doing that, you help to destigmatize the idea of seeing a psychologist for that person who you're having the conversation with. So if everyone's sort of waiting for the stigma to go before they do it, then, you know, we're all going to be waiting a long time.
Anthony, thanks so much for your time. I think we'll leave it there. Super, super helpful. And just again, if people want to find you or find more about you or your business, where can we find you?
Yeah, so Barbell Psychology is my practice. Just Barbell Psychology on Facebook and Instagram, and barbellpsychology.com.au.
Awesome, mate. Thank you so much for your time. Have a good night.
Cool, pleasure.